Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, Global Privacy in the Age of COVID-19, Navigating Unprecedented Change. We'll get started in just a minute. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. All of your lines have been muted to reduce background noise, but please feel free to shoot us questions throughout the presentation using the questions feature that should be on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Today's presentation will be recorded, so if you have to step away from your desk, don't worry, we'll send out the full recording after the conclusion of the live broadcast. I see a few folks are still joining, but we want to be mindful of everyone's time. I know you've set aside a full hour for us, and we very much appreciate that. So let's get started. We've got a great roster of experts for you today. Our moderator is Lisa Lemke, Executive Director at Logility. So let's get going. Lisa?
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today for what is bound to be a very, very informative discussion around navigating privacy concerns amidst a global pandemic. By now, everyone is very familiar with the broad privacy protections conferred to individuals under the GDPR and CCPA and similar privacy regulations across the globe. As we continue to learn about the rash of outbreaks across various industries, and as companies scramble to put policies in place to protect workers and workers who will be returning to work, data will play a crucial role in mitigating the effects of the virus, and privacy concerns remain a pivot point. How can businesses legally and responsibly confront this new reality in a climate where laws and regulations place a premium on individuals' right to privacy? Are there exceptions that businesses can take advantage of? While businesses thought they might have a longer runway to solve for some of the thornier issues and put mitigation measures into effect, return to work is approaching faster than we might have thought in some states, including my own state of Georgia, who begin to lift restrictions as early as tomorrow to reopen the economy as quickly as possible and hastening employees' return to work. So during the next 45 minutes, we want to hear your questions, your concerns, your thoughts, and we would love for this to be as interactive as possible. We'll pause periodically for Q&A, and of course, please do not hesitate to use the chat feature. And of course, at the end of the session, we will leave time for Q&A as well. But now on to our esteemed and experienced panelists, Charlie Britt and Rob Rolfson. Thank you both for taking the time to talk with us today about these issues of pressing and immediate concern for employers. Charlie and Rob are both on the front lines responding to these issues on a global scale, and we will almost all certainly benefit from their knowledge and wisdom. So first, let me introduce Charlie. Charlie Britt is a Senior Privacy Counsel at NCR, a global technology company serving the restaurant, retail, and banking industries. NCR has over 34,000 employees and operates in 180 countries. Also joining us today is Rob Rolfson, Chief Privacy Officer at Asurion, a leading global technology company with over 300 million customers and operating globally in 23 countries. Both of these guys have an alphabet soup of privacy certifications and have a ton of great experience to share with us today. So I'd love to turn it over to both of them so they can share a little bit more with you all about their roles at their respective organizations. Rob?
Certainly. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion today. And as Lisa said, we do want this to be a discussion because the experiences that Charlie and I are having in dealing with this on a global basis really are somewhat of a lens from our own perspectives, but I'm sure everyone on the phone is having different experiences, different questions. We could probably all benefit from that, especially as we move towards the reopening, which multiple states, to include my own state of Tennessee, are beginning to plan for. So as Lisa said, I'm with Asurian here in Nashville. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer. I also lead the Trust Office. As such, we're tasked with ensuring that customers and our fellow employees help understand that they can trust Asurian with their data, because we do have a lot of data, and we want to make sure that we respect the privacy of all of our customers and employees and build that trust into our products and services. Charlie?
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Lisa, for the introduction as well. So my name is Charlie Britt. I've been with NCR for the last 2 years. Essentially started right in the throes of when GDPR was going live and was brought in to help with the GDPR compliance program. I say I've been at NCR for 2 years, although the last month it feels like I've added an additional 5 years with everything that's been going on. But NCR, as Lisa mentioned, is a global technology and services company. We basically build the technology and offer services to help you run, whether it be your store, your restaurant, or your bank or credit union and financial institution. As was mentioned, we're a global company with over 34,000 folks around the world in over 180 countries. So definitely looking forward to talking about some of these issues. Lisa, Rob, and I have had a few pre-calls to try to discuss what we might talk about today. And I think every time we've gotten on one of those calls, there's been a new headline or a new change or a new shift in what's going on out there. And I think that's one of the key things that we'll talk about is how we can quickly respond and make our best guesses, knowing that things are bound to change.
Absolutely, that's correct. Well, so Charlie and Rob, for purposes of this webinar, we'll assume everybody has a very solid understanding of the underpinnings of the GDPR and CCPA, but perhaps you can both quickly explain the types of personal data that are generally protected under these statutes, and perhaps HIPAA as well, that may have implications for employers who are attempting to put mitigating measures into place. Sarah, I think we can go to the next slide, please. So Rob, you wanna?
Sure. So, I mean, I think everyone's aware of personal data, personal information, PII. Different jurisdictions have different terms here, but basically, in a nutshell, what we're talking about is any information that is linked or linkable to a natural person. California, of course, expands that by including households, which is an interesting add. But basically, it's any type of information that can be identifiable to a person. Of course, as we start talking about the current situation with COVID, in order to do the contact tracing, which many people are finding to be a critical component of returning to a sense of normalcy, there's lots of data that's collected as part of that. And so we'll get into that a little bit later, but that data would be part of that. Now, on top of that, as I think we're also going to get into later, there are exceptions around some of this uses, which are documented in the regulations.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, I think folks are certainly getting more and more comfortable with the broad definition in a lot of privacy regulations, such as GDPR, basically any information that can be identified or linked to an identifiable individual. So I think one of the things that we talked about before is when we're talking about a global health pandemic with COVID-19, I think the first type of data that folks immediately think of, which you see some examples on the screen, but you have health data. You figure, well, am I sick? Am I not sick? And I think this is another opportunity for folks that play in the space to consider some of the other implications around data that's collected around these health conditions, maybe more than actually just whether or not you're sick. It may be documenting whether or not that employee plans on returning to work, or whether they have fear of returning to work, or whether they align with certain political statements or mandates that have been made. You may be able to identify more information about an individual through your interactions, through your contact tracing, through the various measures that you may devise in order to try to protect the safety and welfare of your broader workforce.
Yeah, and Charlie, on that point, it also can help identify underlying conditions. And I was reading just earlier today about there's a movement underway by a number of scholars and research scientists who are asking folks to, or groups that are collecting this data, to keep it past the this COVID experience we're having, and they're wanting to keep it for research purposes, which of course opens up completely new discussion points about why are we collecting it, what are we collecting, how long will we keep it, because most people think that this data is only going to be collected and retained during the purpose that it's being collected for. But if we start keeping this as a database of information for future research purposes, there's whole new questions to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Charlie and Rob, I know when we were preparing for this panel, we also discussed that there are some exceptions, to both the GDPR and some of these regulations that are not well understood or well put in place. Perhaps we can touch upon those and make everyone aware of things that they should be considering in light of this global pandemic.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to start. I think that generally, when you examine the text of laws and regulations worldwide that are in the forefront in the privacy space, you tend to find language that supports various exceptions. I would say generally in practice, such exceptions are rarely used. So if we start by talking about GDPR, under GDPR, you are allowed to process personal data if you have a lawful basis. GDPR offers 6 lawful bases, of which some are more recognizable than others, whether it's to fulfill a contract or whether you have the explicit or implicit consent from the individual would give you the right to process their personal data. But when we look at one of the rarely used lawful bases, Article 6E of GDPR provides a lawful basis. The processing is necessary for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest. So the big question becomes, what exactly is public interest? Does a global pandemic fall into that category? Similarly, GDPR, when referring to sensitive or what they call special categories of data, this is your biometrics, your health type of data, other sensitive information as defined in the regulation. There's also an exception that allows you to process some of that more sensitive data. Once again, we have language processing is necessary for reasons of public interest or in the area of public health, such as protecting against serious cross-border threats to health. So on first read, in thinking about the context of the pandemic and what we know about the way it spreads and how quickly it spread from country to country, it seems like these exceptions may be available to allow companies to do some of the things that we've mentioned, contact tracing, various screening questionnaires, perhaps temperature checks, etc., in order to try to understand the exposure within the workplace. Interestingly enough, as we follow the news, various regulators in the European Union have released guidance falling on both sides of the issue. Some of the regulators have made statements that have said that, for example, temperature scanning would not be allowable under the text of GDPR, while other jurisdictions have taken a much more relaxed approach, sort of in light of exactly what's going on with COVID, and are making references to those available exceptions. So it's certainly an interesting space, and we've also seen that some jurisdictions where they initially said, no way, you shouldn't be processing this type of data at the workplace, they've since flipped their guidance as the pandemic has continued to grow and proven to be even a more difficult issue than folks could have imagined originally.
Yeah, and Charlie, we'll circle back to these exceptions and discuss sort of the regulatory enforcement climate towards the end of the presentation. But now as we flip sides, let's focus on some of these mitigation measures that employers may want to implement upon workers returning to work.
No, sure. So I think the question is always, how can we best protect our employees, our workforce, our contractors, our visitors to the facilities at various businesses? Um, and I think one of the key concepts to consider when thinking about what measures you might use is to continue to leverage privacy by design principles and figure out ways to do this in the most minimally invasive way. Um, but at the end of the day, I think generally employers are interested in determining whether there's exposure in the office. And there's been several different avenues that companies have explored in order to try to understand that. Everything from taking mandatory temperature readings when individuals enter a facility. I've seen reports of certain companies using some high-tech camera thermal imaging technology to understand whether somebody may be running a fever. Contact tracing, which is essentially trying to understand if you identify somebody that is not feeling well or is sick or is confirmed case, who all have they come in contact with? What areas of the facility or the building have they visited or have they gone to? It helps to understand where there may be additional exposure. Social distancing is certainly I think the one that is stuck, that's talked about wildly in the news. How can companies transform their workplace? Perhaps you had tightly close together cubicles, or you have an open workspace or common areas. How do you redesign the workspace to allow folks to have at least 6 feet of separation? And then, of course, various questionnaires asking for health information, health history for various visitors that come into facilities. I think any combination of these activities, I think, are being considered by a large number of employers.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rob, I know we've talked a fair amount about contact tracing and the value of it. Perhaps we can go to the next slide, and you can talk to us a little bit about that and explain this graphic to us here.
Yeah, this is a fascinating graphic, but also just real quick, under GDPR, there also is a scientific research exception. I believe it's article like 89 or something, and there are controls required around that, which includes anonymization and de-identification or pseudonymization from an EU perspective. So there are some other exceptions around some of that data. And of course, this all goes back to that balancing of societal interest with the individual rights. And over the past 2 decades or so, we've been seeing that pendulum swing more towards the individual rights. And what's happening now for the first time that I recall is that pendulum is swinging back towards societal interest. We go back in January, I remember seeing news stories of drones in China that were flying around in Shanghai and zooming in, and they say, Lisa, you don't have, they identify you and you don't have a face mask on. So the drones would yell at you to put a face mask on. And they were, it was recording, or someone talking through a speaker. But that sort of privacy invasion of someone monitoring your actions in public back then, and before COVID, people were up in arms about that, and they saw it as an invasion of your individual rights. But now there's a societal interest in helping protect everybody, so there's a lot more willingness to accept and endorse that sort of intrusion on your individual rights. This
and on that note, the Apple-Google partnership that I'm sure everybody has seen to harness phones for infection tracing. I'm curious, how can we do this in a privacy-centric manner?
Oh, yeah, there are ways we can do it. And of course, it's a balance of the individual rights and the societal interests. And Charlie, if I misspeak on the technical issues, I know you're more technical than me. It's going to be, I believe they're leveraging Bluetooth technology, and Bluetooth technology is much more privacy focused than the GPS focusability. Bluetooth, by its nature, doesn't record the individual's name. It's a hash, basically, of the device. And so the way it would work is if my phone, which has a hashed ID, which changes on a regular basis, so it's a spinning number basically, it keeps a log of what other devices it comes in contact with, and it's about a 10-meter radius for Bluetooth. And what Bluetooth will do is it will measure the strength of that Bluetooth signal, because if there's a wall between us, even though we're 10 meters away, that signal is going to be weaker. And so it's pretty good data that they can help understand, the proximity. And then what that Android Apple partnership will do when it gets released, I believe later in May, will be through the health app, and you opt into it, and it does not identify the individual, it just identifies the device, and you have to opt into it. And then if someone were to test positive, they could then alert the system, which would then send a notification to any devices, not to a person, but to any devices which came within proximity in the last 14 days. And it wouldn't say, Charlie, you were within proximity of Lisa. It would just say you were in proximity of a potentially infected person within the last 14 days. You may want to consider self-isolation or something. So what's interesting about that mechanism, which is getting pretty widespread support, is the anonymization techniques associated with it, as well as the fact that the data all resides locally. So the data stays on your device, not centrally collected. Some of the other proposed uses of contact tracing were centrally managed, which then gets into additional privacy issues. So it's a fascinating concept. It's getting pretty widespread support. There's a few limited applications that are currently out there on the market that existed pre-COVID, and I suspect you can see a number more. I know a number of people building up manual applications that do a manual version of a contact trace, but the GPS or the Bluetooth is the best, and Bluetooth is much more privacy focused. This map here is interesting because this is an example of contact tracing. And so this, many of y'all have probably seen it. It came out in the news earlier this week. This was a restaurant outside of Guangzhou in southern China. And this was a multi-story restaurant, 4 or 5 floors. And what happened here was you can see the yellow circle A1, put my glasses on so I can lean in. A1 there was an individual who later tested positive. And within the next week or two, those other individuals, you can see C1, C2, A4, A2, A5, and A3, and then B1, 2, and 3 all tested positive also. The background story here is that those were 3 families that were sitting there at this restaurant in China, and you can see the arrows on the right side. That was an air conditioning unit, and that air conditioning unit was blowing AC. It was hot. It's hot outside of Hong Kong, and so it's blowing air. And the individual in A1, that was a family that had just left Wuhan, and so they were in the early stage, evacuee from Wuhan, and they came down there, and everyone was feeling fine. They had lunch later that day. The patient A1, who was patient 0 in this case, started coming down with symptoms, and they were able to go back and identify the other individuals, the other families via contact tracing and say who else was in that restaurant. They identified the families, and then they monitored them, and you can see 3 of the members of that family at table A became infected, a couple people at table B, and they believe, and it's not 6 feet away. You can see that because of the airflow of that air conditioning unit blowing over, patient A1 is what they're believing. The other people outside that family, the other family members of family A could have been infected from Wuhan already, but B and C had no history of any other exposure. So you can see C1 and C2, they weren't within 6 feet, but it was due to the air blowing over and then bouncing off the walls and coming back. And also the question about whether there's any circulation. So it shows the value of contact tracing and some of the complexities associated with operating a restaurant in this case. No one else in the building got sick, no one else on any other floors, none of the servers, but those couple folks who are around table A.
Well, we can talk more in detail about processes to accomplish this in the workplace as people return. But as we move to our next slide, we've gotten a perfectly timed question What are concerns, thoughts on exposure to discrimination under ADA for current employees or new hires when considering workplace safety for employees? For example, persons with pre-existing conditions, disclosing that to determine physical distancing or isolated placement of that individual's desk or office. Charlie, do you want to hop on that one?
Sure, and maybe Rob can help me out too. But I mean, I think this is clearly a large issue. You know, you're weighing the sort of the societal interest of sharing private information at a time when things are rapidly changing, processes are rapidly changing. The efficacy of contact tracing and other techniques, whether it be thermal scans, et cetera, sometimes becomes questionable based on new data that comes out. And so you have a situation where employers may consider collecting such information, processing such information, and then perhaps they pivot and they want to do something else. So then where does that leave the individual that may have, out of fear, shared some very specific information through an avenue that perhaps they're not used to? Maybe it's not shared through a restricted employer-based HR portal, but maybe it's taken down by you know, an individual that's operating the front desk at a particular facility. So I think these are legitimate concerns that employers should consider when collecting this data, is understanding that there's a lot of areas beyond specifically privacy law that may be invoked. You have FMLA, for example. So somebody that ends up wanting to take medical leave for various reasons, how do you balance being able to process that type of claim, and what questions can you ask, and how do you maintain that information? And you know, it becomes a very, very complicated issue.
Rob, do you have any thoughts to share with us?
I would just, and one preface, I'm not an ADA guy, but you know, it's a complicated area. I think that reasonable accommodations would be expected, and you know, would be the approach here. Additionally, you know, from a culture perspective, a lot of it is also going to depend upon corporate culture. And I would assume that the vast majority of companies are going to take any kind of reasonable accommodations here, as long as that information is also protected as it's being processed and handled. But reasonable accommodations would be what I would expect any company to do here, because this has been a very traumatic experience for everyone. And employees, I can imagine I may have some employees of my own who may have a concern about coming back to work. You know, if we were to, Nashville's not opening up tomorrow. Next week is we're extended through May 1st, and then it'll be a phased reopening. But if we were opening up tomorrow, if we were in Atlanta or something, I may well have employees who said, you know what, I know the governor says it's okay. I'm not quite okay with that. And I would think that most companies would say, do you know what, we're okay. You've been working remotely for the past 6 weeks. I think we'll let you keep it up for a little bit. Because from a corporate perspective, you don't want to get another infection in your workplace. You don't want to have other people starting to work from home again. Additionally, from a pure financial perspective, all the costs associated with a deep clean, once there is a positive test, is not something you want to have to go through. So I would assume that most companies are going to take a very conservative approach in returning back to work and make sure that appropriate precautions are taken. And you know, we talked about the screening upon coming into work every day. There's also simple things that people can do, depending upon the size of your facility. But if you've got, some things that are being discussed is, if you've got 2 stairwells, make one going up and one coming down. That way you don't have people passing each other in a stairwell, because most stairwells aren't 6 feet wide. Elevators, limiting them to people who may need an accommodation to get to the other floors because they can't take the stairs. And I mean, we always hear stairs are better for us anyway, so let's do that. And then, of course, lots of cleaning, mask, and something else that's being discussed is, working in shifts. And what I mean by that is, if Lisa, Charlie, and I share an office, maybe I work every third day, and we take turns going to the office until we get back into a further along the process and back to a normal pattern of work.
Yeah, and to add on a few things that Rob said too. I mean, I think ultimately this is a great opportunity for folks that are working in privacy to lean across the department and lean on your employment counsel. Having those discussions, be in regular touch, because a lot of these issues are crossover issues into the employment context. When we talk about returning to work and whether or not somebody's been working remotely, I mean, I think there's a lot. It depends on the type of business that you run. Many businesses have workforce that perhaps have been furloughed or they've been at home, but their nature of their responsibilities of their job does not allow them to work remotely. For example, if you have site engineers or other folks that are out in the field. So when a company makes a decision to have folks return to work, you immediately open the can of worms around employment issues. If that individual that is unable to work from home then refuses to come back to work, how, from an HR, from an employment perspective, how do you deal with that? And then from a privacy perspective, what information can you ask? Where do you store it? How do you make those decisions to treat people with respect, but also continue to run your business? I think that's a very thorny issue, and I think we'll see a lot of traction, a lot of literature and case studies on that precise point when we see more and more companies returning to work.
Well, we have talked about practical issues such as schools being closed for the time being in Georgia, and before daycares open, many people won't even have the setup in place to actually come back to work. But it's comforting to know we can get a tattoo starting tomorrow. So. Yeah,
Darn,
I think
can't do that in Nashville, so sorry.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, though. It's a complicated issue, and reaching across the aisle to work with your employment counsel is going to be of utmost necessity implementing these policies. Well, so as promised, we said we would pause sort of midway. We've gotten some great questions to jog some additional conversation. Just wanted to pause for a moment and allow anybody who might have a question to type in or pipe in. Okay, I don't see anything coming in, but so why don't we just kind of move on, and as promised, kind of return to the regulatory environment and enforcement environment that we're seeing. Rob, I'll just direct this to you at the outset. So we're seeing organizations facing staff and capacity shortages. We're also seeing businesses facing acute financial pressures. Have regulators issued any guidance that they will interpret these laws flexibly and undertake enforcement activities pragmatically under these exceptional circumstances? What have you been seeing?
Absolutely. So this is the ICO guidance, which is the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, very influential organization. In the UK, at least. In the EU, maybe not as much so anymore. But they've come up with some guidance that indicates that they're going to take a more, that we talked about, that pendulum swinging back towards societal interests and away from the individual rights. And they're recognizing that in today's COVID world, society really is willing to accept a greater level of intrusion into individuals' privacy. And so the enforcement mechanisms that they have at their disposal are going to be relaxed a little bit, and fully anticipate that. And then in the U.S., OCR has come up with additional guidance that they're also going to be taking a more relaxed approach towards some of the enforcement mechanisms that they have in place. And again, it's due to the fact that right now, we really need to flatten the curve. We need to get through this pandemic. We need to get back to work and get this economy back going. And there may be some intrusions into privacy that occur as part of that process. Now, what we should be thinking about from a privacy practitioner's perspective is how do we support that societal interest in getting through this experience, but make sure that that data is not used in the future against an individual, that is not used for inappropriate purposes, that is appropriately protected, that we're only collecting the data that we need to perform the jobs in front of us, and that is not posted in some open S3 bucket on the internet. So there's a lot of, from a privacy perspective, we need to support what we're going through, but let's make sure that when we come out of this, that we have appropriate controls in place around the data that is being collected right now during this COVID experience.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, I think generally, just from my own personal research, I'm finding probably 75 to 80% of the various international regulatory enforcement, both here in the United States as well, seem to indicate that there's some flexibility, that they show some level of appreciation for this global health problem, and that they will relax, sort of some of the enforcement on some of perhaps more routine privacy issues. But at the same time, I think, depending on the type of business you operate, we talked about the Apple-Google relationship and the contact tracing applications. I do think that some of those opportunities, if there's other companies exploring that, I do think that that would be the type of thing that would be in the spotlight during this time. So as Rob said, I think you have to be really, really careful. I mean, it's one thing to collect a little bit of data at your front desk and in coordination with your HR department and try to understand whether you've got potential exposure within your facility. I think it's a completely different issue if you're collecting such database and then you're planning on sharing it with a third party who is developing an app that's supposed to or intended to save the world from future pandemics.
Or even worse, sell it.
Yeah, sell that data. So I think these are some of the things that companies that perhaps are more inclined or operate in the space where they're building and developing new technologies, may want to exercise a good level of caution and not just read the headlines and say, okay, it's relaxed. This is a perfect time to go in and create something without, doing privacy by design, without consulting the regulatory authorities. Because typically when we're talking about these various applications, I mean, this is processing, from a GDPR perspective, this is the special categories of data, this is the sensitive data. And so the scrutiny on those types of platforms is much, much higher just on any given day. And I think with the extended focus on COVID, I think even going forward after the COVID pandemic sort of evaporates, I think the regulators will probably find some examples of companies that were a little bit haphazard with the collection of data and the processing of data. And they're going to try to sort of hide behind the pandemic sort of exceptions. But still, if you're not following the fundamental privacy by design principles, you could really expose yourselves to potential fines and regulatory enforcements.
Yeah, and Charlie, I mean, that's a great point because you do see some administrations around the world. Morrison in Australia is taking some steps. He's getting a lot of pushback from a privacy perspective. You also see regimes in Poland and Hungary that are throwing aside a number of individual rights right now, all in the interest of attacking this COVID pandemic. And the question is going to be, what's going to happen in a post-COVID world? Will those controls be put back in place, or some of these authoritarian regimes going to, not Australia, but Hungary especially, take advantage of this as an opportunity to seize more power?
Well, we're coming up on our 45 minutes and have promised some Q&A time. So you touched on this already, Charlie, privacy by design, but if you all could just leave us with some concluding thoughts and takeaways around best practices and, of course, thoughts on, no one size fits all approach is going to be right in these situations. What would you explain to our attendees as sort of the top takeaways here and best practices?
I think in the world of privacy, it's always helpful to go back to the fundamentals. And privacy by design is such a flexible framework to allow, I think, operating under such circumstances while still trying to protect the rights and freedoms of the individuals. So we've highlighted a few of the key bullets there, but collect only what is necessary. If you decide you want to collect temperature, document what you think you're gaining from collecting temperatures, or if you have a questionnaire with various questions, understand which of those questions are truly needed and which ones are not. Retain it only as long as needed. Do you need to create a manual log of the first name, last name, and temperature for somebody entering your facility every day? Or would it be okay to dispose of that immediately after the reading comes back in the non-fever range? Those are sort of the types of questions you may want to ask. Certainly, to the extent that you are collecting and storing information, you're going to want to leverage and partner with your security departments and your CISO organizations to make sure that you're applying protections. Once again, going back to one of my previous points, this space is evolving rapidly. Things are changing rapidly. Processes are being stood up very quickly. And sometimes that may involve some more manual interactions versus a full-blown system that may be leveraged to process this information. So whether that information is written down by hand or stored in a computer or on an Excel sheet or in another type of system, you want to make sure that the appropriate security controls are in place, that you have the access limitations, that if somebody were to break in, make it extremely difficult for them to be able to fetch that data. And then probably one of the final points just around, folks and their personal privacy, who can you share the information with, right? So you identify that an individual is sick or maybe tested positive for COVID. I think in times like this, the knee-jerk reaction may be, interesting for management to know. And other folks may share that information perhaps somewhat freely, but consider what the potential ramifications are. You think about something like the California Privacy Act that the enforcement, the Attorney General has said that they plan on starting enforcement this summer, regardless of what's going on out there. Now there is an exception, sort of a carve out for the employer-employee data perspective, but once again, it's one of those sort of balancing tests to determine whether the processing of this health data may or may not fall into that exception under the law as written today. And so potentially from a California law perspective, you may be opening yourself up to private rights of action and statutory damages for breaches if you lose that spreadsheet and you have California residents within your workforce. That could expose you to some quite large liability. Of course, that's just one state example of many others in any other areas around the world. So I think that's a point to stress, that you really need to come up with a process and identify who exactly needs to know, why do they need to know, and try to limit that as much as possible. And then number two that you see on the slide here is, you really have to look at the jurisdictions. You can't necessarily, if you're an international organization, you have a presence in the UK, don't take that as a universal European approach, as Rob mentioned. Certainly with Brexit and the UK exiting out of the EU, there's some interesting sort of frictions around privacy laws within those regions. So while they're very well known and they're very well influential, you really have to look at your operations within the various countries and make risk-based decisions based on the amount of workforce, the type of processing you do, the type of business that you run in these jurisdictions. And like I said, we've seen perhaps 75% of the regulators have seemed to indicate a relaxing of their enforcements, but that leaves quite a few, that 25%, who have still made very strong statements against the processing. So you'll want to follow those developments very closely and make sure that you adjust policies accordingly if you feel you have a high risk in a particular country.
Rob, do you have any closing thoughts before we move on to some of our questions that we have been coming
excellent points, Charlie. I agree with everything you said. As a security guy, I really endorse the protecting of the information, making sure you've got appropriate security, appropriate encryption, least access principle, making sure that only the right people have access to that data and that access is reviewed and logged to where you have an audit trail if necessary. On the do not sharing component of that, one thing to make sure of is that if you have any third parties who are part of any of these solutions, make sure that the contracts you have in place with those third parties are appropriate and cascade these requirements to them, and that they have to have the appropriate controls in place. They need to they can't retain the data past whatever period you tell them, and that you've got appropriate audit rights and breach notification requirements in there too. And then on that last point about the jurisdiction, the European Data Protection Board came out with additional guidance yesterday, and it's evolving rapidly. All these different organizations all around the world are coming out with new guidance on a daily basis on what is and what is not acceptable. And perhaps we're going to see that pendulum swing back to more individual rights focused in the next couple months. But for now, it really is focused on how do we as a society get through this pandemic and get back to some sense of normalcy.
Well, thanks for that practical advice. And now to turn to some questions that have come in. Rob, I'll direct this to you since you talked to us about contact tracing and the benefit there. We have a very technical question. Does Bluetooth have to be actively on, or is this a function that is always operating, even when you have
always
your Bluetooth
operating
off? Always operating. Okay.
Yeah, and think about it. So here's Bluetooth. I mean, there may be a way to turn it off, Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, but Bluetooth is basically what you use to connect to your speakers, connect to your earbuds, connect to your car. There may be a pairing requirement, and that pairing requirement is what allows you to connect from one Bluetooth device to another. But that capability is always out there searching for other Bluetooth compatible devices to be able to connect to. What this technology from a contact tracing perspective would do would basically, if it senses that there's another Bluetooth compatible device within range, it would log the fact that that device is device number 12345 and I'm 12346, whatever, and that number spins constantly. So it's got a strong hash, and there's a log kept on the device of other Bluetooth devices that you've come in contact with during the past 14 days.
Yeah, I would add, I think that's exactly right. I mean, certainly you can disable Bluetooth signaling and make yourself undiscoverable. And I think this kind of speaks to the efficacy of these types of solutions when you think about the broad population, their access to resources, their access to phones with these various technologies, but really then the know-how from a technical perspective or the know-how from a privacy concern perspective. Can how do we notify the individuals that perhaps don't want to download this new application onto their phone, but they do leverage Bluetooth on their phone, and they do leave the signaling on a regular basis because they use wireless headphones, or they use it to hook up to their home speaker or connect to their TV, etc. I think there's tons of, or their car, for example, when you hop in your car, for cars that have that capability. What do you tell those individuals from a privacy perspective that the pings that, let's say Rob is walking down my street and the pings from his device are hitting my device, and then that information about my device is being used for a purpose that I'm not necessarily aware of, beyond Rob, simply trying to connect to my device to leverage its speakers or something like that. So I do think there's a lot to be said of how you actually roll out and make people aware of the various on-off switches, and then what are the ramifications, and where does the efficacy land after folks have considered and perhaps don't want to participate, or do participate, or don't know how to participate correctly. Where does that leave us at that point?
Yeah, and because what's required for any of these contact tracing apps to function effectively is you need to get a large enough segment of the population to adopt and use it. Singapore rolled out something I think it's called like Trace Together, and they thought they were going to get everybody in the country because it's Singapore, and basically everybody does what they're told to. But yet they had a very small percentage of the population that actually downloaded and used the app. So it's not as effective as it could or should be, which is one of the attractions about this Apple Android partnership, because of the subscriber base they already have in place and the people are already using Bluetooth technology all the time anyway. So they think they'd be able to get a much better buy-in and much more people opting into that data collection and data sharing, because it would be anonymized, it would be protected. And again, going back to that societal interest, there's an overwhelming societal interest in doing that and being able to alert you. And I'm gonna say Lisa, Lisa, that you may have come in contact with somebody 10 days ago, and so you want to protect everybody else. Whereas if I'm the infected one and I was asked to identify everyone who I've come within 6 feet of in the past 2 weeks, now I could do it pretty easily. But in a normal situation, I wouldn't. I mean, I'd say, okay, I went to the grocery store, I went to church, I went to the movie theater, I went to the gym, I went to a hockey game, and who did I come in contact with? I have no idea. Contact tracing is a technical solution to help facilitate that societal interest in identifying who are the potential exposure points there.
Yeah, and just to add, and not to throw a massive geopolitical bomb on the issue, but I mean, you think about what that sounds like for just the individual on the street, potentially walking around, being able to be identified as the person that has this condition, walking around with a badge or some sort of label, and then potentially being, discriminated against, or perhaps assaulted or somehow persecuted because of what they have. That certainly we have many unfortunate examples in history that starts to creep into. And so I think it's important, as Rob was saying, depending on how these technologies are created and how they're used and how they process the data, becomes extremely critical, because I think a lot of folks around the world, and that Singapore example is particularly interesting, just seeing where we have examples where people may or may not be willing to adopt similar types of technologies. I think there's a lot of issues in historical reference points that probably scare people.
Yeah, and Charlie, on that point, so as you develop that, let's say you had that app and you were using it, what do you do if the government comes to you and says, we want all those records? Now, in the US, it may not be as big of a deal. In some countries, it may be a significant risk for your employees. They may, in the Philippines, they could be executed or something. They could be put in prison. You don't know. And so it's going to vary by jurisdiction. And so you need to think about that as you're implementing what types of data you're collecting, because if you don't know people's names, you can't turn it over.
Absolutely.
Hash is one thing.
Well, we've got a couple more questions, and this question is a prime example of, I think, when to include your employment counsel. But what documentation should employers be providing to their employees regarding workplace safety measures? What enforcement measures are or are not appropriate? For example, enforcing a 6-foot rule.
So you can lean on governmental guidance. You can say that the government is requiring these sorts of controls from a city or state perspective in order to return to work. And so these are the governmental rules. These are not necessarily things that any particular company is developing or creating,
Right.
but it's governmental.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you want to rely on, and once again, we see a lot of the political debates, cascaded on the news and such over the last few days. Certainly here in Georgia and Tennessee, as the governors have made decisions to reopen the economy. But I think the conservative approach and the right approach is to consider lots of different sources of information. Perhaps the governor is one point of reference, but considering some of the other organizations, World Health Organization, the CDC, those guidelines, if you're leveraging some of those independent scientific studies to the decisions that you're making, the documentation that you're providing to your employees to help them understand the measures that you're adopting in order to try to curb this, I think you're in a much better spot.
Thank you. Okay, and I think our last question, one of the tenets of GDPR is that I can ask what info you have on me and have that deleted at my request. I assume that provision goes away in the face of societal benefit. And back to our earlier discussion, does it matter if it is the government collecting it versus a private company?
You want me to take that, Charlie? You want it?
Go ahead.
It's like
yeah.
yes, and maybe. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I don't have to. So correction, under GDPR, I don't have to delete data because you asked me to. I need to delete data if I no longer have a legal basis for retention. So if I've got a documented rationale, a documented basis for that retention, I don't need to delete it just because you asked me to. So assuming that there is no legal basis for that retention, then yes, we would have to go through that normal data deletion, or actually it's not deletion, it's obfuscation. You don't really delete data, you obfuscate it, because if you delete data in a database, it's going to break, it could possibly break the database. So you're obfuscating it.
And Rob, potentially while you're on this topic, we've gotten a question about data retention periods for corona-related health information. Perhaps you can address that and what differences there may be. It's probably still evolving, but
It's evolving. So
definitely
some
evolving.
people have said it's not going to come back in the fall. Other people have said it's going to come back hard.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, you consider the antibody testing, right? So understanding whether somebody may have some sort of immunity because they already had it. How is that data used? When the pandemic is over, you've got this database of information. Perhaps your lawful basis evaporates right at that moment. And so depending on when you get that data subject access request or that right to be forgotten request, I think those are things that you have to reconcile. But Rob is right. I mean, you really have to understand the personal data you're processing. Once that lawful basis expires, i.e., you don't have a need or another lawful basis to hold on to it, then you're going to have to respond to those requests. And I would expect, given the sensitivity of this data in various jurisdictions around the world, I think companies will probably see some level of a spike of employees exercising their data rights as it relates to some of the information that they may have had to give up over the course of this.
Charlie, excellent point. An example there, let's say you're doing daily checks and you require employees to fill out a questionnaire every morning when they come in, and maybe you take their temperature. If we agree that the incubation period is 14 days, if Lisa doesn't have a temperature for the first 14 days, on day 15, do I still need that day one temperature check? Is there a rationale for keeping that data? Because the whole purpose you collect that data is to be able to go back and find out at what point she became infected and go back and find anyone else who was in regional, local contact with her during that 14-day period. So you may not have, maybe that a reasonable retention period for that temperature check, maybe not necessarily the antibodies, but temperature check might be 14 plus 1, 14 plus 2, something else, but maybe not 3 years. So you need to think about the reason you're collecting the data and then understand what's the rational basis for that retention.
Well, we're coming up on the hour, and I think this might be a great question to leave our audience on. For businesses who are struggling to get together a cohesive, response plan and potentially task force to address these issues, what would be your advice around who should be on a COVID privacy and employee safety committee? Different organizational roles. What about for a very small organization?
Yeah, I can answer that quickly. I mean, depending on the size, and I know you tailed that with a small organization, you want to have the folks that have the experience that's going to help. So from a marketing and sales perspective, you may have, or public relations may have good abilities to generate documentation, to generate messaging for the employee base. Certainly your real estate folks, your facilities folks, the ones that are frontline in the facilities, they should have a stake in the process. You obviously want legal to be involved if you have a chief privacy officer, et cetera. Employment counsel, I know, is something we've talked about. Your IT department, depending on whether you're leveraging IT solutions. I think there's a lot of different stakeholders depending on the size and scope. But at a minimum, you're probably going to want some help around the messaging. You're going to want some help around managing the actual business locations, and then certainly legal help is probably the minimum set of folks that I would get together.
Yeah, Charlie, on top of that, I would also add facilities or whoever is managing your facilities if it's a third party, and then procurement in some capacity, because if one of the conditions for returning to the workplace is that employees are required to wear a facial covering, I'm not saying mask because masks might not be available, but start thinking about what types of supplies you will need. Maybe it's additional cleaning supplies. Maybe maybe one of the requirements might be doors need to be remote control activated to where someone can open them without touching the handles. So think about those sorts of things too, because there may be some requirements that you need to plan for now.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for being with us for this hour and sharing your expertise and such great practical and pragmatic guidance for us. Your organizations are lucky to have you on the front lines, advising them about their responses. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.